Everybody. Welcome into episode 20 of Awakening the Ordinary. My name is Daniel Clower, and it's good to be back. It's been a while. In this week's episode, we are going to, first of all, be doing some housekeeping. I'm going to explain a little bit about my hiatus and how we're moving forward from here. After that, I'm going to be diving into this week's topic, which is spirituality. I'm going to be sharing with you my perspective, some of my opinions, and getting us on the same page so that we can really dive even deeper into the topics in the coming weeks. But first things first, thanks for tuning in. It's really good to be back. I was on a bit of a hiatus in some ways just because of scheduling. My daughter got back into school and we were working with a new schedule and just kind of trying to figure out how things were going to work from here. But while I was gone, I was also doing some soul searching. The thing is, this channel was never really supposed to be a strictly news channel. It wasn't just supposed to be talking about politics and, whatever daily news stories were going on. Believe it or not, this was actually supposed to be a philosophical, spiritually minded channel about my awakening journey, basically. Now, I happened to start this channel right before the inauguration of our current president, and so I wanted to talk about politics because I truly do believe that politics is spiritual warfare, as I said way back in episode 1. I think that politics reflects our moral and spiritual health in this country, and it's important to look at current events through a lens of spirituality. I still believe that, but the issue comes when I try and talk about what is essentially breaking news. I have time constraints. I have 2 toddlers and a 3rd grader. I also have a beautiful wife who deserves so much more time and attention than I could possibly give her anyway. So when we tried and covered these breaking news stories, it was always unsatisfying because we would be rushing to get these videos out, rushing to get the script together, rushing to edit, and then by the time we finally finished editing due to our own equipment and time restraints, we would post the video and a lot of the news would be out of date by then anyway. Now, that's not to say it wasn't still accurate or still important to talk about. It absolutely was. But for example, when talking about like the Epstein case, I would put out videos and by the time the videos went up, there would be more new and incredibly important news to the point where the stuff I was talking about, even though it was only a couple of days old, was basically old news at that point. So moving forward, I want to make a change. So as I said, this is episode 20 of Awakening the Ordinary, but in some ways, it's kind of episode 1 of our new chapter. Moving forward, I am definitely still going to be talking about politics and news. It's really important to me. It's a passion of mine. I enjoy doing it, but I can't keep up with the pace of trying to talk about breaking news stories. It doesn't work. So instead, I am still going to be talking about news, but not every episode. I can't promise exactly how often I'm going to be talking about it, but what I plan on doing is doing almost a post-mortem of news stories. As they happen and then develop and then, typically speaking, come to some kind of conclusion or at least an extended lull, I'm then going to jump in and start talking about the story as a whole. We'll look at it from the beginning and move forward. We'll look at it through a lens of spirituality and through the new paradigm of an awakened mind, I guess. And we'll just talk about the effects of it, where we're going to go from here, what it all meant, how it all turned out, what the next steps should be, that sort of thing. Now, when I'm not talking about news, I'm going to be talking about what this channel was originally supposed to be about. Philosophy, spirituality, the awakening journey. And yes, sometimes when I talk about the awakening journey and the paradigms and systems that we're in, it's going to be political in some ways. When I talk about, for example, the capitalistic system that we're in and how that causes these uh, unfair systems that hold certain groups down, that's kind of inherently political, but it's also deeply integral to the awakening journey. So if you come here for the news, stick around. I'm still going to be talking about news. I don't want you to feel like you have to now bury your head in the sand because you can't keep up with everything. I'm still going to keep up with everything for you. If you come here for more of my spiritual talks or uh, the more philosophical side of things, then you're in luck because we're going to be doing a lot more of that from now on. So that's sort of the housekeeping that I just wanted to get out of the way. Again, I don't really want to promise a certain type of schedule or saying, 1 week we're going to do this and then it'll flip flop and we'll do something else the next week. We're going to be kind of playing it by ear for now. And I hope you can join us for the ride. Now, as I said before, I'm going to be talking about spirituality in this episode. But before I really dive into spirituality, I guess I want to kind of lay the foundation. This is going to be an interesting episode because in this episode, I'm talking about spirituality. I'm talking about what it means to me personally. And in the next episode, I'm going to be talking about an awakening, to an extent, my own awakening journey, and basically what all of that means. Now, I consider these two topics to be incredibly integral and intertwined to each other. I think it's almost impossible to talk about one without the other. So, in some ways, I'm going to be kind of trying to do the impossible because I'm talking about two sides of the same coin, but I'm only going to be talking about one side this week and the other side next week. To do that, I think it's important to lay some groundwork. So in a minute, I'm going to talk about the definition of spirituality and then what it means to me personally. But first, I just want to get you in the right headspace to even have a conversation regarding spirituality. First of all, it's important that you understand that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a temporary human experience. The origins of this quote are largely debated, but it's one that I hold personally dear and true. When we go through our lives, you are so much more than just the meat suit that you're walking around in. You mean more than that. And you mean more than just the few dozen years that you get on this planet. You are an infinite being in a nigh on infinite universe. And that means that everything that you do now in your life stretches out so far beyond your immediate surroundings. To that end, I'd like to share another quote. The 5 colors make a man blind. The 5 tones make a man deaf. That's a quote by Lao Tzu. He's the author of the Tao Te Ching. What that essentially means is that when you limit yourself only to the sights that you see around you, the tones that you hear around you, you are limiting your perception and therefore your experience of the entire world. It's kind of like the tagline that we use at the end of every episode. When you change your perspective, the reality changes. And I mean that in, honestly, a very literal way. I also mean it in a metaphorical, spiritual way, but it applies literally and biologically as well. There was an experiment conducted back in the 60s where cats were taken and at a formative time in their life were kept in separate rooms. One group of kittens was kept in a room filled with only vertical lines, and another group was kept in a room filled with only horizontal lines. During that formative stage, that's all they saw. And then as those cats were brought out into the greater world, they were essentially blind to the type of architecture that they had not experienced growing up. So the kittens that were only shown horizontal lines growing up could not perceive vertical lines in the real world. They were blind to them, and vice versa for the other kittens. I'll give you another example. There was a tribe in Namibia that didn't have a separate word for green and blue. They had one word. And so studies were done on this tribe that showed they were actually not able to perceive as many shades of the color blue because they did not have a separate word for it. So when they were later introduced to a separate word for the color blue, as opposed to one shared word for green and blue, they then were able to develop a greater sense of shades of blue. Actually, I'll share one more experiment that was done. It was an experiment on a group of monkeys. And I'm probably going to talk about this in the next episode as well when I talk about awakenings. But I think it's really important to just set the foundation for our spiritual discussion as well. So there was a group of a dozen or so monkeys that were held in captivity. They were put into a cage, and in this room was put a ladder. And at the top of a ladder was a banana. When a monkey attempted to climb the ladder and get the banana, it would trigger an alarm sound and some water splashing down from the ceiling. Frigid cold water. So it was a very uncomfortable experience for these monkeys. Then another monkey would go up and try and grab the banana, and the same thing would happen. And they did this to condition the monkeys, to teach them exactly what would happen when they tried and get the banana at the top of the ladder. Well, the monkeys learned, and then at that point, if a monkey tried to go up and get the banana from the top of the ladder, the other monkeys would drag him down and viciously beat him. Okay, so fast forward a little bit. After the monkeys learned this behavior, the scientists took out one of the monkeys and replaced it with a new one. Well, this new monkey, they didn't know what was going on. They didn't understand the rules. And so they would go and try and get the banana at the top of the ladder. But before they could get up and trigger the alarm in the frigid water, the other monkeys would, of course, grab him and drag him down and beat him viciously. And so the scientists went and slowly and gradually replaced every one of the monkeys who had experienced the original alarm and frigid water. And so eventually they got to the point where there were 12 entirely new monkeys in this cage. None of them had experienced the alarm or the frigid water. And yet, because their society had taught them the rules of the ladder, they all still abided by it. So anytime a new monkey came in and tried to climb the ladder and get the banana, they would be snatched down and viciously beaten before they could get there. These monkeys didn't know why. They had no recollection of the alarm or the frigid water. They just knew that was the way things were. And they were absolutely unable to accept any kind of change or any kind of experimentation otherwise. So I shared all of these stories with you for a reason. I wanted to, I guess, kind of formulate the idea in your head that if you think you've got a good handle of what's going on around you, if you think you pretty much know how the universe works, if you think you know everything you need to know about spirituality, you're wrong. The only thing I know is that I know nothing. So let's get into spirituality. Let's get into my beliefs. Let's get into what spirituality in general means and how I apply it to myself. I do just want to make sure I emphasize here that everything that I'm talking about is essentially just my own personal opinion. I am going to be sharing some factual items. I'm going to be sharing, for example, quotes from the Bible, and those are accurate quotes. They are in the Bible. I will at times talk about the, original Hebrew or Greek or whatever. That's factual. That's true. That's not really up for debate. That's just how it is. But much of what I talk about is going to be my interpretation, my own opinion of these things. So I don't want to sit here and pretend like I am this grandmaster who knows all of these things. I'm not going to pretend to be some enlightened entity who has all of the answers. I just want to get this out of the way. These are just my opinions. So if you disagree with me, that's totally fine. I would actually love to hear how you disagree with me and why. Hit me up in the comments below. Hit me up on Discord. Whatever you'd like to do, I'd love to hear from you. And especially if you have, factual backing behind it. I'm all about that. So come at me. Let me know your opinion. I would love to hear it. But I just want to make sure that you guys understand that I am not pretending to have some secrets of the universe that are unknowable or anything like that. That being said, let's talk about spirituality. So the dictionary definition of spirituality is the quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material or physical things. And I think that's a great definition. I would also add that as sort of a personal working definition, one of the ways that I consider spirituality is basically just your relationship with God. Now, I guess, should pause here and say, I understand that a lot of people, because of maybe some past trauma that they've had with the church or with Christians or religion in general or whatever, they don't like using the word God. And to that, I say, okay, that's totally fine. I've got no problem with that. I know some people like saying source or spirit or whatever. Doesn't bother me. I'm totally fine with whatever you want to say. I'm coming at this from a Christian background. I say God. I'm not going to be bothered if you say something else. And I guess to that end, I should point out, many times, most of the time when I'm referring to God, I will say he. That's not because I think God is some white guy with a white beard sitting in the clouds looking down at us. That's not what I believe at all. I understand that God is not a human on the binary male-female gender spectrum, but that's just what I'm used to. I'm used to saying he because that's just the background I grew up in, and so I don't mean anything by it. It's just how I refer to God. And just total side note, just to be honest, God probably has more feminine qualities than male qualities, just because of the nurturing and the creation and the creativity and all that stuff. But that's getting into a whole rabbit hole that we don't really have time for today. We're going to be getting into plenty of other rabbit holes instead. So just wanted to get that out of the way. I say God, I say he. It absolutely does not bother me if you say something else. And I guess I should also, since I'm talking about my background, just mention, you guys should know I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus. I believe Jesus died on the cross, and in doing so, sanctified the human race, fulfilled the old laws, and that is our gateway to heaven, basically. Now, that being said, I know that probably turned off a lot of people immediately upon hearing that. I'm not the biggest fan of the modern day church. So if you are worried that I'm going to be preaching at you, or I don't know, in some way judging you or anything like that, that ain't me. And actually, I'm probably going to be spending a lot of my time talking about many, many, many of the issues that I have with the modern day church. In fact, I think probably the greatest enemy to Christianity in general is the church as a whole, which is a really sad thing to say, but I think it's true. So that's just my background. I just wanted to get that out of the way so that you guys could understand where I'm coming from and my beliefs. Now, Even knowing that I'm a Christian, you probably don't know all of my beliefs, and that's totally okay. That's a big part of what this channel is about, is just kind of sharing my beliefs and how many things that I believe may not line up with mainline Christianity. And yet, I have a lot of biblical backing for what I believe. So we'll get into that later. There's one particularly controversial idea I'm excited to share with you guys, just to sort of uh, dip our toes in the water and show you where I'm at. But we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so spirituality. Like I said, one of my working definitions that I find comforting or easy to use is that spirituality is your relationship with God. And in many ways, more so, not just your relationship, but specifically trying to align with God, trying to take on his perspective, trying to live your life in the way that you think most closely matches what God has in mind. So I mentioned how spirituality and an awakening journey really go hand in hand, and how it's kind of hard to talk about one without the other. So let's talk about why that is from the spiritual side of things. When you engage in spirituality, if you are trying to align your perspective more so with God's, you're taking on that 10,000 foot view. That is inevitably going to lead to you having more empathy. That is inevitably going to lead to basically an understanding of universal oneness, how we are all not just a part of the same system, but how we are all genuinely a part of each other and intimately, deeply connected. And what affects me affects you in a literal way. It leads to you really considering more so the concept of self at all. What does self even mean? What are you? It involves rejecting materialism, as the dictionary definition said, because you're more so focused on the ethereal, the supernatural. And you're not just focused on things that can be measured and quantified in a data-driven way. And I guess this kind of all really echoes back to that quote I mentioned: the 5 colors make a man blind, the 5 tones make a man deaf. Because when you're only looking at life through the lens of materialism, you are shutting yourself off to so many things. There's only so much that you can quantifiably measure and get hard data on. And sure, you can argue something like love, for example. You can say, oh no, you can measure love because you can, measure the endorphins that go through you and kind of measure the size of somebody's pupils as they're looking at somebody that they love, and yada, 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 all that stuff. That never really gets to the heart of what love truly is. And that's not to mention how materialism in general sort of rejects a lot of what mainstream science would probably call like fringe or pseudoscientific ideas, things that are starting to come more into the mainstream, like, for example, telepathy with the telepathy tapes. I know there's a ton of controversy around all of that, but it's really interesting stuff, and it's completely rejected inherently by mainstream science because it's just uncomfortable. It's like squicky and like ewy. They don't like anything that can't be physically measured. They just don't like it. And so they immediately sort of disregard it out of hand. We'll be talking about all that stuff a little more down the road, maybe a lot more down the road. But again, I'm just kind of trying to lay the foundation here. Spirituality inherently entails loving yourself and everybody around you deeply with the kind of love that God has for you. It involves understanding that all of these little, small, everyday coincidences are not just coincidences. They're miracles. You and I get to see miracles and live miracles every single day. And I'm not just talking about the big, crazy things like when you just by happenstance avoid a major accident that absolutely would have taken you out right then and there. I'm talking about the little tiny things. When you're having a hard day and a cardinal flies right up to you. When you're driving with your family and thinking about the world and suddenly you see the most beautiful rainbow. Every event that you and I undergo is infinity to one odds of ever happening. Actually, there's a quote from a musical that my daughter is absolutely obsessed with lately. It says, "Every life is unbelievably unlikely. The chances of existence almost infinitely small. The most common thing in life is life. And every new life is a miracle." Yada, yada, yada. Great song. But the point is, the chances of you being here and now, the chances of you watching this video right now, the chances of us having any kind of a conversation or dialogue are so infinitely small that it's really worth taking the time to step back and embrace it as the miracle that it is, instead of just brushing it off, letting it slide, saying, oh, well, that's life. Life is a miracle, and it's beautiful. And that is what spirituality is to me. So let's dive a little deeper, because obviously spirituality is not just embracing the fact that you are surrounded constantly by miracles and that you should thank God for it. I think it's a big part of it. I think having constant gratitude and embracing these miracles and understanding that your life is divinely touched is a big deal. It's not something that should be brushed off lightly, but it's also just barely touching the surface as to what spirituality really is and what it means to me. And so now, I think it's time we talk about Jesus. And actually, my wife is really what kind of set me straight on this. It was just after we got our oldest back into school and we were kind of getting used to our new schedule and sort of just trying to figure out how the whole recording thing was going to work. And we were talking about the news and we were talking about everything going on. And she said, we really need to be talking about Jesus more on this channel. And she was right, of course. We do. And it's not because I am a fire and brimstone preacher who is going to knock you over the head with the Bible and tell you you're wrong and you need to repent or you're going to hell. That's not me. And in fact, I think that kind of thing is one of the biggest problems that Christianity has nowadays, is people thinking that they know so much about something that they clearly don't understand that well at all, and using it as a bludgeon and a weapon to harass people, to condemn people, to try and feel better than other people. I think it's a huge problem. And to that end, I want to talk about what Jesus means to me. And I want to talk about some of the things that he said that your church has probably never told you. There is so much wrong with modern day Christianity, with how much they seem to talk about hatred, and it's just completely antithetical to what Jesus talked about. There is so much just judgment and greed and deceit rife in the modern day church. It makes it so odious. I can hardly blame people for completely turning away from the modern day church. And it's happening in droves. I mean, less and less people every year report going to church on any kind of regular basis whatsoever. Here's the thing. I am a Christian, and I am a Christian in what I consider to be the truest sense of the word. Christian, that word itself means one who follows the Christ. I'm not really in this to follow what a pastor says. I'm not really in this to even necessarily follow what some people in the Bible said. I'm in this to follow what Jesus said specifically. And I find it kind of ironic that many of the things that Jesus said would be considered incredibly controversial to talk about in a modern day church. And to that end, I actually want to talk about one of those controversial things that Jesus said. And I'm not just talking about the whole love your neighbor as yourself and all that stuff. I know that is unfortunately, surprisingly controversial to a lot of people. That's not what I mean. I'm talking about something that is actually deeply controversial and would probably get you called a heretic if you talked about it in church. So let's kind of rewind a little bit to the whole universal oneness thing. I know that probably caught a few of you guys off guard when I mentioned it, so I want to dive in a little deeper. And I promise this relates back to Jesus too. We are all created in the image of God. And that doesn't mean that we are all created in a way that makes us look like God looks. That's not what that means. God breathed his soul into man. That's different than the way that animals were created, the world was created. Human beings were created in a special, specific way that involved God breathing his soul into us. So what does that mean? Who cares? He breathed his soul into us. Well, Jesus kind of talked about this a little bit. It's in John chapter 10. People are gathered around Jesus and they're just asking him, hey, dude, can you just stop speaking in parables and, giving us these riddles and stuff? And can you just say whether or not you are the Messiah? Simple yes or no. Are you the Messiah? And Jesus tells them, I already told you guys, but you don't want to listen because you're not part of my flock. But I'm telling you right now, the Father and I are one. And they get mad about that because they asked him a question they didn't really want the answer to. And so they start picking up rocks because they're going to stone him. So they all gather around and they want to beat Jesus up and they want to stone him to death. And he says, hey, wait a second. Wait. Is it not written in your laws, I have said you are gods? And when he said that, he's referencing back to Psalms. So it's not really in the laws per se, but he's referencing back to Psalms 82:6, which says, I have said ye are gods, and all of you are children of the Most High. So, okay, so Jesus is saying, it's not blasphemous to say that I'm God, or that I'm one with God, or that I'm a God, because in Psalms, it says all of us are gods. And I thought that was really interesting. So I kind of dug into the concordance to see exactly what they meant by that, because I know in the church that I grew up in, if you were to say something like, I'm a God, they wouldn't have taken kindly to that. So I thought surely the word must be something else, but no, it's not. If you pull up your concordance, you'll see that the word that they use in Psalms is Elohim. That's the same word that is used many times throughout the Bible to describe God. Now, there are many words that are used to describe God. There are many names he's called by, many words that are used, but Elohim is a word that is used to describe God, including, there was one verse in particular that stuck out in Isaiah 44:6. It says, thus says the Lord, the King of Israel and his Redeemer, the Lord of hosts, I am the first, I am the last, and there is no God besides me. And that last one, there is no God besides me, that's where they use the word Elohim. There is no Elohim besides me. So God is saying there is no other Elohim, but clearly in the Bible, it says you are all Elohim. And Jesus even referenced back to that when he said, the Father and I are one. So what does that mean? This is what I'm talking about with universal oneness. It's not, the point is not me saying you are a God and so you're above everything else and, yada, yada, yada. That's kind of the opposite of the point that I'm making. We are all one in a literal and true sense. Even biblically speaking, we are all one. We are all part of the same Elohim. We are all part of God. We are all granted the authority to protect and create and do our best to essentially create heaven on earth. That's what we are here for. We're here to do our best to make sure that we create a heaven on earth. We are all part of the same team in a literal and true sense. And so when I talk about universal oneness and when I say these things that you may think sound a little woo-woo or whatever, understand that it's not just coming from, a dream I had or whatever. It's coming from a biblical background. Jesus is saying the same thing. So if you have a problem with it, do some research. Tell me where I'm wrong, because I'm not making this stuff up. Jesus himself said, you are all God's. You are all part of God. And so I'm going to be talking about things like universal oneness down the road, especially. There's concepts called the laws of the universe. I'd love to dive into all of that. But it involves talking about the interconnectedness between us all. And not just in a metaphorical way, like, if you do good to other people, it'll eventually come back to you and stuff like that. I mean, yeah, I believe in that stuff. And I believe you should do good in general because you should do unto others what you want them to do unto you. But I'm talking about, in a literal sense, the actual interconnectedness of us all. And what does that mean? I'm going to be diving into all of these concepts much, much deeper in later episodes. I don't want to get too sidetracked because I said this episode was really just about us getting on the same page. So I know people really like having easy to understand labels. Unfortunately, to me, spirituality is not about labels. Every spiritual experience is entirely bespoke. It's completely customized to your own journey. So, in some ways, you might incorrectly call me a Gnostic Christian. That's not really accurate. But I do believe some of the things that Gnostic Christians believed, like the fact that instead of focusing so much on orthodoxy and religious tradition, you should focus more on a personal relationship with God. And in the same way that God spoke to people for thousands of years, he can speak to you too. You don't have to go through a priest or a bishop or a pastor. You can have that relationship with God yourself. And if he needs to speak to you, he will. He can do that. And sometimes that's going to be in really dramatic ways. Hearing a thundering, booming voice. And in some cases, it's going to be a very still, small voice in the shower. And in some cases, it's going to be you happen to open a random book to the right page and see exactly what you needed to see. In some ways, I appreciate a lot of Taoist philosophy, Buddhist philosophy. The idea of universal oneness is, in some ways, very parallel to things like reincarnation and stuff like that. But it has its parallels. And so a lot of the philosophy that goes into those other religions are philosophies that I appreciate, even if I don't necessarily employ the spiritual or religious aspect of them. So when it comes down to a label, when it comes down to trying to say, hey, Daniel, can you just check a box and say exactly what you believe? I really can't. I'm sorry. I'm a Christian, though. I believe in Jesus Christ. And I think you should too. But I definitely don't think that that means that you have to go to a specific church or go to a specific denomination or follow any specific orthodoxy or religious traditions. I just don't. As far as philosophies that I subscribe to, I'm a big fan of Alan Watts. He's a more modern day philosopher that I uh, really enjoy listening to and reading. Um, Carl Jung's ideas about the collective unconscious, I think, are really um, interesting and I think have a lot of merit. And specifically when it comes to things like shadow work, which really isn't even necessarily a spiritual idea at all, but it's more so just I don't know, a wellness philosophy. I think it's really important. And I think that's in some ways more related to the whole awakening kind of side of the coin. So I'll probably leave a lot of that for that discussion. But just to give you a gauge of where I'm at, so you can kind of understand, and we can be on at least the same book, if not the same page. That's where I'm at. So thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode of Awakening the Ordinary. I know it's very, very different than what I usually have done, but I'm excited for it. And I think in many ways it's probably even more important than what I've been doing. So please let me know your thoughts below. If you agree, if you disagree, if you think I'm a loony, whatever, let me know. I'd really genuinely love to hear from you. You can always hit me up in the Discord. I've got links in the description below to like my TikTok if you want to see shorts there. I've got like a donation page if you want to buy me a burger, whatever, basically. So, as always, thank you so much for tuning in. And don't forget, when you change your perspective, the reality changes. I'll see you soon.